In this video, I would like to review the connection between percent, fractions, and decimals. Percent, remember, means out of 100. The per cent, the word cent, is 100 in the French language. So if I want to talk about 25%, I can take my whole unit, and my whole unit here is in red. This is my 1 unit. I can break that 1 unit into 100 sections, and then 25% would represent 25 of those 100 squares, represented right there. So 25 out of 100, or 25%, is equivalent to 0.25 out of 1. I'm just dividing by 100 going in this direction. 0.25 out of 1, 25 100ths out of 1, which can also be represented in fraction form, 25 out of 100, which is 1 out of 4, or 1/4 of the unit. So 1/4 of my unit block is equivalent to 0.25 out of 1. My decimal is equivalent to 25%. I have represented this quantity that's shaded in percent form, in decimal form, and in fraction form. All of these numbers are the same representation of the shaded quantity. Now things can get a little trickier when we start talking about percentages under 1%. Again, here in red I have my 1 unit, which is my 100%. And 1%, remember, is one of those 100 units. What does it mean when I have less than 1%? So to help us understand this, I'm going to take my 1% square, and I'm going to expand it into its own set of 100 squares. So think of there being this little square here being divided into 100 squares. So what I have over here on the right is my 1%. If I wanted then to talk about 0.25%, that would be 25% of the 1%, which would be this, which back on my original diagram would be 1/4 of the 1%. So putting all this together, 0.25%, which is 1/4 of 1%, as a decimal, in other words, dividing by 100 to make it out of 1 unit, that would be 0.0025, meaning, looking at my decimal places, tenths, hundredths, thousandths, 10,000ths, 25 10,000ths of my original 1 unit. And if I reduce 25 over 10,000, I will get 1 out of 400. So 1 out of 400 is what I have shaded on my hundredths chart on the left. In other words, 1 out of 400 in fraction form is equivalent to 0.0025 in decimal form, is equivalent to 0.25 in percentage form. In terms of percentages over 100%, again, we know that our large red square is 1 unit, or 100%. It's the original amount. 50% would then represent half of the original amount, or 0.5. 200% would then be 2 of these unit blocks. In other words, 2 times the original amount. 200% as a decimal being the number 2, meaning twice the original amount. 150% as a decimal number would be 1.5 times the original amount. So when we have percentages over 100, we're talking about having something that's more than our original amount. Now you need to watch the wording with percentages, because if we say we have an increase of 50%, what that means is that you have 50% plus the 100%, you have 150%, or 1.5 times the original amount. Let's say a class has 10 students. If the class increases by 50%, 50% of 10 would be 5, but that would be the increase, so we would now have 15 students, which 15 is now 1.5 times our original amount. And an increase of 100% would mean that you would have 100% more than your 100%. In other words, you would have 200%, or 2 times the original amount. Here's an example. 10 years ago, a painting was estimated to be worth $1,000. Today, the value is $1,600. What percent does the painting's current value represent compared with the value 10 years ago? So we want to get the percentage value compared with 10 years ago. In other words, what this question is telling us is that our original or base amount is the amount 10 years ago, which is 1,000, and our value today is 1,600. So if we decimalize that number, we're going to get 1.6, which when we divide, we know that's 1.6 out of 1. In other words, 1.6 is the decimal, which means the percentage is multiplying that by 100, 160%. In other words, the painting is 160% of its original value. And you'll notice my question asked me the percent of the painting's value compared with 10 years ago. But in part B, we're being asked by what percent has the value increased. Remembering that the original percentage, the original value is the 100%. The new percentage is 160%. So therefore, the percent increase is 60%. So you need to read the question carefully in terms of whether you're being asked for a percentage of the original or the increase in the percentage. Okay, let's just do some examples converting between these various representations of a given quantity. If we have 0.78 in decimal form, remember 0.78 is meaning out of 1. As a percentage, which is out of 100, we would need to multiply our decimal form by 100 to get percent. We would have 78%. And 78% as a fraction is our 78 out of 100 reduced to lowest terms. And so we can reduce our fraction. 39 over 50 in fraction form is the same as 0.78 in decimal form, is the same as 78% in percent form. 4%, well, we know that 4% is 4 out of 100, so that would be our fraction, 4 out of 100, which reducing that would be 1 out of 25, 1/25 of the whole. And our decimal form then can be found from our percentage by dividing by 100 back to 0.04 out of 1, or 0.04. This is the same representation as this, is the same representation of this. They all represent the same thing. If we're given 9 out of 5 in fraction form, we can convert that to a decimal, which would be 1.8. And 1.8 is 1.8 out of 1, which, since a decimal is what something is out of 1, our decimal form would be 1.8. And our percentage form, which we know is out of 100, we would need to multiply this by 100 to get 180 out of 100. We would then get 180%. So 180% is the same as 1.8 is the same as 9 out of 5. And one more, if we have 0.0056 as a decimal, which means it's out of 1, we're talking here about a fraction in which the denominator is tenths, hundredths, thousandths, 10 thousandths, and we have 56 10,000ths. If we reduce that number down, you would find it's 7 out of 1250. So 7 out of 1250 is equivalent to this decimal, and as a percent, since a percent is out of 100, we'd need to multiply this by 100. That would be 0.56%.